So the South African government tells us it believes tourism is important. But it doesn't seem to come through in the South African government's actions. There's a new book out. It's by Anita Mendiratta, and it is called Come Closer, Why Tourism is Shaping the Future of Nations. And she's joined us in the Gibbs studio today. Tourism, it's a global trend. The 1980s, 1990s, the early 2000s, tourism exploded. And it feels like it's contracting a bit, is it?
Quite the opposite. It's the third largest sector in the world behind banking and finance. It's currently employing 1 in 12 people around the world. It is generating $1 trillion in revenues, and it's on an upward growth. So we're looking at 3 to 4% in the last 3 years consistently, and despite the recession and despite the economic downturn having its impact on mobility.
That is completely counterintuitive. The world has no money. Nobody has any spare money. Economies are stagnating, and people are travelling more, or simply people travelling better.
People are travelling smarter, and they're travelling differently. So one of the lovely things about the recession is that it caused people, the travellers, to look at how they travel and where they travel more cleverly. They're doing a lot more online buying. They're doing a lot more price competitiveness. Equally as well, they're looking at shorter breaks closer to home rather than the long-haul trips. So rather have 4 or 5 little holidays during a year and then taking that once-a-year long-haul trip.
Which is shocking news for us in South Africa, because here we sit at the bottom tip of Africa. We're a long way away from our traditional hunting grounds for tourists.
And yet, the beauty is, and this is where that one country that really gets it, and I hear your opening statement about the question of is that audible around the country. We do have a government that really understands the value of tourism. Minister van Schalkwyk several years ago was brilliant in his statement that tourism is South Africa's new gold. It exceeded the impact in terms of GDP value, and importantly, it employs. It brings people together to be able to actually be productive as citizens. So during the economic downturn, there was a significant shift in the South African strategy to domestic tourism, which basically meant South Africans can take advantage of their own country, keep traveling. You get the year-round travelers as well as a result, so you don't have those dips in the low season. So there's a lot to be said around the way in which this country has built tourism.
I'm fascinated by that perspective because I don't feel it. And I feel, talking to South Africans, we're a very expensive destination. Often it feels it's cheaper to go to Mauritius than it is to spend 2 weeks in a similar accommodation in Cape Town, for example.
Indeed, it can be, and sadly the World Cup, naturally, like every major event, has a tendency to bump up prices quite dramatically, and we got stung by it and we learnt the lesson, and that's human nature. That's around the world. One of the challenges about tourism, it's a very emotive industry, and it's one industry in which every single national plays a role because they're a host. So even if you're not technically employed by the tourism industry, and we're looking at 500,000 people in this country that are, and that's direct versus 1.3, which is indirect, so people who support the tourism industry. Every single South African is a host, like we saw with the World Cup. So that's a way in which, as a result, everyone has an opinion about tourism. Everyone often, well, not everyone, people often forget that it is a business. It's not an NGO, and we need to make sure that we're investing in it in that way.
Do we invest enough as South Africa in tourism?
Strongly, strongly. I always argue, what if we didn't? If we didn't have the World Cup, what would our country look like? What would the airports look like? And more importantly, what would our flag look like? Even now, when you hear Shakira's song on the radio, your shoulders can't not move, and you get that feeling of where you were when you were watching everyone go deaf from the vuvuzelas. But the pride is incredible.
But I feel like we've run out of that runway.
That's something that needs to be fed by all citizens, but equally by government as well. We need to be reminded. Any country that's growing up, and still, we're a teenage nation. We're still very young. And if you look at Egypt now, they're an infant. They're having to restart the process. One of the greatest dangers of any country that is reshaping itself is optimism fatigue. People are hopeful for a better future. And you need to constantly give them proof as to why we have so much still to believe in. And our government has done an enormous amount. The challenge is that we speak about our government generally, and we look at the government as this mass. It's always about finding the individuals that you can really believe in.
Is Martin van Schalkwyk a hero of tourism?
He is an absolute champion and leader of tourism. The heroes of tourism are the tourists. And the heroes of tourism are the people who work in the industry to take care of the tourists, not just in a positive hospitality way, but making sure that tourists don't get hurt, they don't get ripped off, and that they see the best. So the heroes should never and can never be the leaders.
We hurt our own, we rip off our own. Why should we treat tourists any differently? I'm being facetious, of course. Now, we talk about African tourism, people coming into South Africa. Do they get a fair shake, or do we like the Germans and more we like the Chinese more?
We are seeing very rapidly that you can't judge tourists by their currency and by their passports. And again, one of the beauties and the silver linings of the economic downturn, it's forced us to look at the industry from the numbers, not from the faces. So with what's happening in the Eurozone, that's a region that is crying to get the tourists back, because if you look at a country like Spain, almost 15% of its GDP is based on tourism. They need the tourists to keep people off the streets and stopping from rioting. But they are too busy with their own problems, and they simply can't afford to travel. That's opened up new opportunities for us because it's forced us to look at new markets. Who is wanting to come here? Why are they wanting to come here? Is it for lying on the beach in Cape Town in the middle of December? No. They want to go shopping. That's yield. You should never judge a tourism destination based on arrivals. We don't bank tourists. They'd suffocate.
We do judge on arrivals, and that's a tragic... it's a tragedy of our tourism strategy in terms of measuring the success of tourism. If we measured it differently, would we get a different outcome?
Indeed. We do measure it, we don't talk it. And that's one of the biggest challenges, and that was one of my favorite chapters in the book, is terminology. We use a terminology that doesn't have a heartbeat. It's always about what is the value of the tourist, what is the economic value of it, what is the value of the tourist in terms of them being a voice box around the beauty of the country. We don't want hundreds of thousands of tourists coming in on chartered planes, dropping water bottles on our beaches and insulting the hotel staff. It's about the right type of tourist who's going to come here, appreciate South Africans, appreciate what South Africa is doing to really take care of itself and build its future and own its future, and then go back and tell people that those who criticize South Africa, either go and see it for yourself or stay home and be quiet. There's a lot of value there.
Anita Mendiratta, we will leave it there. Richard Quest says when she speaks about tourism, global leaders listen. Now you know why.